Hello, thank you for joining us today for Promises Kept, holding corporations accountable for their commitments to racial justice. We're delighted to have over 100 plus attendees for this webinar. And I'll start by sort of outlining what will be happening today. Can you advance the next slide, please? So at the end of 2022, the Rudd Center published a report analyzing the targeted marketing of food and beverages to Black and Hispanic consumers. To start off, I will briefly discuss the various targeted corporate social responsibility campaigns and initiatives we compiled for this report and explain how these do not erase the negative health effects of the products food and beverage companies choose to promote to Black and Hispanic consumers. And then Kirsten and Jim will take the discussion of food and beverage companies forward by sharing the findings from a recent Healthy Food America report that details the extent to which food and beverage companies took action on commitments toward racial justice in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the recommendations for what they must do going forward. And then after that, we'll go beyond food and beverage company commitments. Olivia Knight of As You Sow will discuss how her organization uses racial justice scorecards to monitor progress on companies' racial equity policies and practices, including environmental justice. She will also cover how her organization motivates companies to make concrete changes in favor of racial equity. And then Shanece and Mark from CommonHealth Action will focus on the findings and lessons learned when evaluating organizations' commitments towards equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then they will move towards discussing how CommonHealth Action works with organizations to turn their words into actions. After the presentation, we will bring all presenters back on the screen and begin our Q&A. So please be sure to submit questions in the Q&A section on Zoom rather than in the chat. And I'll be using this as a guide for the questions at the end. If you have a question for a particular presenter, please note that when you're submitting your questions. Also, the webinar is being recorded and links have been collected from the presenters to information attendees will find of interest. All of this information will be available on the Rudd Center's website after the webinar. So I'll begin now with my piece. As I mentioned, what I'll be covering here is a piece of our targeted food and beverage advertising to Hispanic youth and consumers report that we published in November of 2022. Next slide, please. So the reason we are concerned about food marketing is that there are just countless studies really that link food marketing exposure to unhealthy diet and weight, and poor diet is responsible for 1 in 5 deaths globally. Next slide, please. But when you look at what's advertised, really 80% of it is for foods and beverages that are really not good for anyone's health. Even though, $14 billion at least a year is spent by food and beverage companies at this point. This data is from 2017. But what's promoted does not, help. It really harms people's health. It doesn't help their health. Next slide, please. So when we did this report, we did look at exposure to food and beverage advertising on TV, and we also looked at the amount of money top companies spent. But we also identified over 70 statements made by food and beverage companies, and we categorized them into 3 themes. But I'd like to focus on the corporate social responsibility ones. Next slide, please. And for this particular piece that I'm going to contribute today. So what we found was that many of these focus on social justice causes, including encouraging social justice conversations, discussions of voter suppression laws, voter education programs, and grants and partnerships with NAACP and other groups. So for example, Sprite talks about inspiring people to get involved and to vote. So that's an example of one of the statements that we found. There was also diversity in media and marketing communications. That's sort of another bucket that these fell into. So Mondelez pledged to eradicate harmful stereotypes in media and advertising, and Tyson announced that it would ferret out social media content that was toxic to minority consumers. And then also there were discussions of more diverse representation on product packaging in some of these company statements. Next slides. And then there was also a group of things we identified as cause-related campaigns, scholarships to Hispanic and Black youth, support of minority youth sports, and cultural causes. And all of these were linked with the products and companies listed here. Next slide, please. But when you look at what was advertised and where companies put their money, when you look at spending, particularly on Black targeted TV channels, and these are channels where 50% of the viewers self-identify as being Black, really the majority of money that was spent on advertising was dedicated to candy, sugary drinks, and snacks, and very little on healthier products. And when you look at the money spent on Spanish language TV, it is pretty much the same. The majority of dollars on these least healthy product categories, and very little spent on healthier categories. We also found that there was really no, Black and Hispanic youth continued to see more ads on TV. And there was actually increased spending from when we looked at these numbers from 2017 to 2021 in spending on Spanish language TV channels. And those were dollars spent for unhealthy food marketing. So the food and beverage companies seem to recognize the importance of Black and Hispanic consumers, and this positive corporate social responsibility demonstrates this commitment, but it really doesn't erase the ability for their promotion of these products to affect health. And their choices to pair unhealthy foods with these cause-related marketing campaigns really may be more harmful than brand marketing, as they build goodwill with consumers, towards products that are not good for their health. And I would encourage you to look at all the pieces of our report. This is a very small piece of it. We have them available on our website at this link, and that link will be available on our site later, along with everybody else's. Thank you very much for your time. I want to thank my co-authors and the marketing team. And then I'd like to turn it over to our next presenters, Kirsten and Jim. Thank you.
Great. It's really good to be here with you today, and thanks for joining us. Just a brief mention about Healthy Food America. We're a nonprofit. We're based in Seattle, and we support healthy food policy across the US through advocacy, research, and field building. And advancing equity in nutrition and health is really core to the work that we do. The power and influence of and money of food and beverage companies is huge, and they have a large impact on food and health and racial justice. This particularly came to the fore during the reckoning sparked by the murder of George Floyd in 2020, which prompted them to make statements and commitments to ending racism and supporting racial justice. Can you go back, Kristen, to the previous slide? We thought that it'd be useful to document their actions as a step towards holding them accountable for contributing to a more racially just America. Are they going to do what they said they were going to do? And before we get into our report, I just wanted to recognize that Kirsten and I, though we were leads on this work, many other people participated, including Vic Coleman from Seattle University, who helped conceptualize the project, and a number of students at the University of Washington, including Aspen Avery, Kelsey Aronson, Chelsea Wilden, Rachel Ross, and Kirsten Tucker. And also thanks to the partners on this webinar today who also helped us think through this work. Next slide, please. So why care about what Big Food does? That's the focus of our report. Big Food's the largest food and beverage companies in America. Why care what they do? Well, their behaviors and actions have a large impact on health and health equity, which we can look at through a public health frame called the commercial determinants of health, how actions of corporations affect health. For example, how healthy or unhealthy are the products that they sell and market? Or what are their positions that they take on public policy? What's their role in electoral politics? What are the working conditions in their businesses? Who do they engage as vendors and suppliers? So any of these actions that they take on racial justice as a result of their pledges have to be viewed in the broader context, as Fran already alluded to, in terms of their other activities, their other commercial activities, including marketing. Next slide. So the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020 by a white police officer, that seems so long ago at this point, almost another era. But it provoked a widespread sense of outrage, and the Black Lives Matters racial justice movement across the US and globally demanded justice and demanded that we deal with the deeply rooted racism in American society. Many companies spoke up, including food and beverage companies, and they said that they were committed to working towards a more racially just society. Because of all the power that they have, these food and beverage companies are well positioned to contribute to policy systems and environment change that might promote racial justice. So we wanted to look to see what they were doing, because when we started this project, the extent to which they actually acted as opposed to made statements was not clear to us or anybody else. So we ended up analyzing the racial justice actions taken by the 25 leading US food and beverage companies during the 18 months after George Floyd's murder. And we'll share with you what we learned. Want to make sure that it's clear that we are only trying to tease out what they did in response to the murder and not their more comprehensive diversity, equity, inclusion practices. That was beyond the scope of what we've done. Next slide. So I'll turn it over to Kirsten now, who talked about how we did this and what we found. Just want to let you know that pretty much everything we're talking about is available in the report on our website. The link is here and it should be in the chat as well, so you can get the full report there. So now I'll turn it over to Kirsten.
Great, thanks, Jim. It's a pleasure to be speaking with everyone today. So as Jim mentioned, we identified 25 leading US food and beverage companies, and that was based on revenue and sales data. And then we collected publicly available information. And when we say publicly available information, we mean info that we could find on company websites, in their various reports that they released, press releases, and social media accounts. And we were specifically looking for racial justice statements, commitments, and actions taken in response to the murder of George Floyd for the date of George Floyd's death through October of 2021. It's worth noting that a lot of this information for some of the companies was pretty difficult to find. It was buried deep within reports and also within, oh, my screen just advanced. And also within websites. And so once we collected that data, we determined the status of each action to either be complete, in progress, or unknown, meaning that we just couldn't find enough information to tell us what sort of follow through had happened on a commitment. We compiled data specifically for each company and sent that to each of the 25 companies for verification purposes. And we did hear back from 16 of the 25 companies with additional data and updates. And we included that additional data that met our inclusion criteria, and also we were able to verify it online. And from there, we analyzed the data, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about that in a minute, and developed recommendations based not only on our findings, but also of the work of others doing this similar racial justice tracking. And we found a great resource in the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance's 2021 CEO Blueprint for Racial Equity, which will be shared on the Rudd Center report, along with the rest of the resources that Fran mentioned earlier. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but this is just a quick snapshot of the 25 companies that we included in our project. So a little bit more about how we organized our data. So for each action, we categorized them into 12 different categories based on typologies developed by other organizations doing similar work. And then further grouped these 12 categories into their spheres of influence. So whether they influence the society at the society level, community level, or company level. We also identified the categories of actions that we felt would have the highest impact. And we defined that to be the actions most likely to produce structural and systemic changes with the potential to impact many people versus a few. And these categories are bolded on this slide and include supporting law and policy, increasing diverse suppliers, and increasing diverse employees. So what did we learn? Well, 21 of the 25 companies that we looked at did have some sort of racial justice statement acknowledging the murder of George Floyd and making some sort of commitment to act. So because that is what we were specifically looking at, our analysis focused specifically on those 21 companies. The number of actions varied quite substantially across companies. So ranging from 4 to 18 actions with some progress including completed actions and actions in progress. So that's noted in the dark green and the light green on the bar chart. And companies completed 27 to 88% of announced actions. So I want to call out that there are some limitations to looking solely at count of actions as a direct measure of corporate performance. So this metric does not account for the time and resources that are needed to implement an action, nor its potential impact. So some actions, like signing on to a collective action pledge, are relatively effortless to complete, while others are going to require a lot more time and resources, such as increasing a company's Black employee representation. So we also looked at how frequently companies addressed each of the racial justice categories that we introduced earlier, and we saw significant variability here too, with respect to both the number of companies addressing a category, as well as the number of actions completed or with some progress in this category. So as you can see on this chart, making donations, hosting employee conversations, and providing employee trainings were the most common categories addressed, and were also perhaps the most easy to implement. For example, giving money is relatively simple to do. In contrast, the less frequent categories, supporting law and policy, providing community resources, and hosting community conversations, is more externally focused and requires a little more effort and community partnerships to implement. Also of note, less than half of companies made progress in influencing the high impact categories that we identified, and those are highlighted in yellow on this slide. So before I turn it over to Jim, just two more quick things. One, I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but we do have company-specific profiles for each of the 21 companies available on the Healthy Food America website if you're interested in taking a look at a specific company. And finally, I do want to make the point that our report focused specifically on corporate racial justice actions, but it's important to kind of consider those actions in the greater context of other company actions that are taken that may actually work to increase racial inequities, such as predatory or racialized marketing practices. And some companies may also support policies, candidates, and programs that block progress in racial justice and health equity, or fail to promote pro-equity policies. So on that note, I will pass it back to Jim to talk about our recommendations. Oh, Jim, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, so back one slide. So the first, can you go back one slide, Kirsten? Okay, so the first one, so we developed a set of recommendations based on what we observed and learned, and we'll share those with you briefly, and they're more detailed in our report. But first, it's critical that the food and beverage companies continue to support and increase their support for Black communities, whether it's supporting public policies that advance racial justice for those communities, or where they support specific community-based efforts in communities across the country, such as supporting Black businesses or Black cultural organizations. It's also really important that they refrain from and actually oppose activities and policies that increase racial injustice, whether it's discriminatory voting laws or whether it's their own practices of racialized marketing. We recommend that companies increase their game in providing impactful donations to anti-racist organizations. As Kirsten mentioned, while they did make donations, they tend to be very small, minuscule proportions of their annual revenues, and so they should be contributing more. Next slide. They should make sure that their internal business practices align with advancing equity by achieving diverse employee representation, for example, at all levels, including the C-suite and their board members, and market their healthiest products, not, as Fran mentioned, not their most profitable ones. They also need to have we need to develop meaningful metrics for corporate performance, and we'll hear about that more from some of our other partners on this webinar later today. And then finally, while the companies are making a lot of progress, as Kirsten mentioned, it's not really easy to find their progress and to really ascertain from what's publicly available whether they're doing what they say they're going to do. So much more transparency is needed for all their actions, whether positive or negative, that might affect racial justice, including more transparency in the political sphere of campaign contributions and lobbying activities. Next slide. So I just want to thank you for your time and attention, and we look forward to answering any questions that might come up in the Q&A section. And now I'm thrilled to turn it over to Olivia Knight from As You Sow, who will share more about the work that she and her organization do to implement change.
Thank you, Jim. Hi, everyone. I'm Olivia Knight. I'm As You Sow's Racial Justice Initiative Manager. Having some issues with the slide deck, apologies. And I'm here to, I'm sorry, could, Carson, would you mind going back to the original slide? Thank you. And then next slide, please. Okay, well, I'll tell everyone a little bit about As You Sow first. I think the slides may have gotten a bit out of order. As You Sow is a Bay Area nonprofit based in California. We have a 30-year track record of promoting environmental and social corporate responsibility through shareholder advocacy and coalition building. As You Sow communicates directly with corporate executives to collaboratively develop and implement business models that reduce risk, benefit brand reputation, and protect long-term shareholder goals, while bringing about positive change for environmental and human rights. As You Sow created the Racial Justice Initiative and the Racial Justice Scorecards in June of 2020 to track and monitor corporate progress on racial equity following George Floyd's murder. The overall purpose of the initiative is to monitor corporate actions on racial equity, to hold those companies accountable, thereby ensuring that corporate statements of support for racial justice are indeed translated into concrete actions which truly promote equity. Next slide, please. So our initiative has created racial justice scorecards on the Russell 1000. We assembled knowledge and issue area experts to advise on key performance indicators, which apply to companies across sectors and indexes. We've created 27 KPIs on corporate racial justice statements, DEI policies and practices, and external actions related to racial equity, including environmental justice. The scorecards rank public companies in the index, and we plan to expand to the Russell 3000 by the end of 2023. As You Sow only grades publicly available information and focuses on sharing it broadly with a variety of stakeholders. We use information found on corporate and governmental websites, corporate social media, trusted secondary and tertiary sources, which in total build compelling cases to track corporate progress on racial equity. So as you can see on this slide here, you see a screenshot which shows our data visualization tool, which is publicly available on our website. It also is has an encompassing research methodology with it. Our data is updated quarterly and annually. And as you can see on the other side, our 27 KPIs are broken down into 7 pillars: the racial justice statement, acknowledgement of key terms, corporate responsibility, DEI departments, DEI data, external actions, and environmental justice. Our overall scoring system allots 20% to the statement language KPIs and 80% to corporate policies and practices. Next slide, please. In 2021, we added 4 KPIs on environmental justice to our racial justice scorecards in order to build a more encompassing environmental track record for these public companies. These on the screen are our 4 KPIs: public acknowledgement of the environmental justice movement, abiding by environmental regulations for the past 5 years. Using EPA data, we collect that. Total environmental fines and violations for the past 5 years, again, EPA data. And a sector analysis of adverse effects on BIPOC communities for the past 10 years. This KPI takes a deep look at a company's core business practices and outcomes to determine a historic track record on environmental and racial justice. Next slide, please. So our goals for our environmental work include integrating social and environmental concerns into our corporate engagement. We do this by finding synergies between our objective scorecard metrics and localized community engagements across the US. We are working to build trusting relationships with fence-line communities across the country and are amplifying their real stories to push for actionable, concrete change at the corporate level. Our work seeks to educate stakeholders on the intersections of racial and environmental justice through climate, food, and farm justice. Next slide, please. Since As You Sow is a nonprofit focused on shareholder advocacy, we use shareholder resolutions as a tool to hold companies accountable for their inaction on environmental, social, and governance issues. The Racial Justice Initiative files resolutions on a range of racial equity topics to motivate companies to acknowledge and counter systemic racism in their policies and practices. In the past, resolution topics have included DEI disclosure and corporate transparency, racial equity audits, and environmental injustices. Next slide, please. As You Sow and Racial Justice Initiative have used our power as shareholder advocates to enact the following types of corporate change at major public companies. Increase in DEI disclosure on key metrics such as promotion, retention, and recruitment rates of people of color within the company, as well as key EEO-1 disclosure. Increased corporate diversity and DEI policies, including anti-racism trainings for all employees. Increased corporate community engagement programs and efforts focused on environmental justice. And lastly, increase awareness of corporate involvement in cases of environmental racism. Next slide, please. Thank you all for having me here today. It was my pleasure. With that, I'll hand it off to Shanece and Mark.
Thank you, Olivia. In our presentation, we will go over some research findings. Unsurprisingly, our findings are similar to those who have presented before us, but we are more than delighted to share some of our lessons learned and the work that we are doing with organizations in the private and public sector. We noticed that a lot of companies were publicly making EDI commitments after the death of George Floyd. What we wanted to know is how many companies were actually making plans or have started to carry out their commitments. A year later, we decided to do a commitment report and begin to strategize how we was going to track the EDI commitments from these companies. We began conducting our research in November 2020. The first method that we did was create a survey, and we sent out that survey to nearly 75 companies. These companies were spread out throughout different industries, such as academia, health, finance, technology, entertainment, hospitality, and retail. We only got one response from that for that outreach. So we decided to switch up our approach to collecting data and focus more on our company's framework to build a report. The first thing that we did in this process was split our research into 3 categories: policy, program, and practice. We wanted our research to center around how organizations are using their equity lens. For context, the equity lens is the lens to which we view conditions and circumstances to understand who experiences the benefits and the burdens of these organizations' policies, programs, and practices. We use these 3 categories to measure what the companies were doing the most. Were they creating new policies around EDI? Were they creating new programs around EDI? Or were they creating new practices around EDI? Then we extracted the data from the company's websites, reports, media releases, social media, such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and placed the information under the category that best fit. As we were disseminating the data into these categories, we quickly learned that a common factor between most of the companies was that they created partnerships to help push their commitments forward. In addition to learning about partnerships, we also learned that some companies were already committed towards EDI prior to the death of George Floyd. However, the spark of social unrest made companies look into their already stated commitments towards EDI, and some companies actually changed the route that they was taking to develop a more equitable workplace and to increase corporate responsibility. Overall, funding or donations hit a all-time high in almost every industry. Some of the things that we found that really caught our attention is within the food industry. Companies shook the status quo by building new structures to support and bring in diverse talent and increase pay. They also made significant investments in Black and Brown college funds such as HBCUs or HSIs to diversify the future of the workforce. There were also new forms of advertising, such as including more people from historically unrepresented identities on social media and in other forms of communication. Food industry campaigns focus on showing the diversity of people involved in food production, preparation, and service. Avenues of uplifting farm workers and others who work the front lines to feed the country also became the central focus of many campaigns. Another industry that caught our attention was the finance industry. In the finance industry, you will find most companies were putting forth the effort to create and support Black and Brown entrepreneurship, home ownership, and education. Some institutions invested in research and preventive measures to fight the COVID-19 pandemic as a way to protect and support Black and Brown frontline workers. They also created pathways to diversify leadership within their sector. This industry also made a concerted effort to increase the inclusivity of women and LGBTQ plus individuals with the focus on improvements to hiring practices and procedures, sustained leadership, and the creation of equal pay pathways. Over time, what we realized that as time goes further and further away from the 2020 social unrest awakening, many companies have stopped publicly reporting on their social media handles about their commitment, which means that the general public would either have to contact them directly to receive an update or visit their websites to comb through reports looking for their progress. The issue here is that failing to educate the public where you are on making these commitments creates a sense of neglection, not just towards the people serving the corporation, but the communities that the corporation serve. I am now going to turn it over to my colleague, Mark, where he explains how we work with companies or organizations to make their commitments a reality.
Thanks, Shanece, and thanks everyone. It's great to be here with all fellow presenters here today, and great to join everyone else that's in attendance in the audience. So as Shanece said, I wanted to expand a little bit on what we've been talking about to share a little bit more about our work in the world. So our work is really about developing people and organizations to produce health through equitable policies, programs, and practices. So in short, we really strive to make it easy to be equitable. This slide here is an example of how we often work with organizations in terms of how they want to advance their goals related to racial justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we'll often start with an assessment, as you can see here in the yellow. And what this assessment really strives to do is to provide a point in time snapshot of the organization through different methods such as surveys, focus groups, and key informant interviews, looking to both internal and external stakeholders to do a few things. One, we hope that it can hold up a mirror for the organization to understand how current operations and culture are experienced by those different stakeholders. It's also meant to generate questions for further exploration later on in the process, right? It doesn't necessarily provide us all the answers, but it can help to surface new questions. And it also aims to invite an openness to learn more, right? To understand better and to deepen something that we like to talk about as perspective transformation. So that takes us to our next phase, which is often the learning phase, which you can see here in green. In the learning stages of work, we're often working with organizations through training and other learning experiences with a training that we have called our Foundations of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. We also have courses specifically focused on things like implicit bias and allyship. All of these are designed to help prepare individuals and organizations to make decisions and act more equitably, and for individuals in both their professional lives, but we hope also in their personal lives as well. Throughout the course, and throughout our courses and throughout our learning experiences, learners may experience what we like to call some constructive discomfort that we hope is able to pave the way for meaningful, long-lasting change. So ultimately, we're hoping that these courses and the learning experience that individuals go through help to achieve what I mentioned earlier, perspective transformation. And perspective transformation for us is, this idea that once people start to see things and understand and know things in maybe a new or different way, that it can then lead to new and different behaviors, decisions, and actions. And so I want to come back to the strategy phase in just a moment, but first I want to talk on this concept of perspective transformation, recognizing that for us and for the organizations we work with, we really try to make sure it happens at both the head and the heart level. So in order to achieve this transformation that is really changing, how we do our work in the world and how we live our lives, we need to engage both the head, right? And so that's where we're talking about things like facts, and we're using logic to figure out what our next steps may be. But also it's about using our heart, right? And considering what are our values and what are our own expectations and definitions around things like fairness and things like justice. It's the combination and the connection between the head and the heart, both understanding and both achieving this perspective transformation, where perspective transformation can really be achieved. And so once we really start to move towards that point is where we can start to create equitable policies, practices, organizations, societies, where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. So going back to our strategy work, the strategy work is really the attempt to make sure that EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion are woven into the fabric of all aspects of the work of an organization, and that EDI is a comprehensive strategy that is built into everything that is happening within an organization. It's also meant to build commitment and efficacy to manage and implement changes that then lead to transformation. So what I'm showing on the screen here is a way that we like to work with clients. And this model has been adapted from an organization called the Interaction Institute for Social Change, who does great work out in the world as well. And so what we try to do with organizations is to one, identify that current reality, right? And so that's really what that assessment process can help to do, to help us develop that shared or help people at an organization develop a shared understanding of truly what is happening, what is the issue, and then what requires attention and needs action. So that agreement on the problem is an incredibly important foundation for then building agreement on what the solutions we're going to develop are, and then what those goals are that we want to address root causes. Because oftentimes it can be very easy to identify symptoms as what are the things we want to address, but it's agreeing on those problems and getting down to those root causes that can really help us make that transformational change. The next step is to figure out, well, what is our desired state? Where do we want to be, right? What is the desired impact, result, or outcome of this change effort, including changes in both kind of the structural arrangement, so how things are organized, but also in terms of power relationships, in terms of how people interact with one another. And this is also where, how will we know when we get there, right? And so this is looking at our goals and measures of success. And finally, what are our pathways to action? So how do we go from our current reality to our goals? And so what actually needs to happen to make that a reality? And this isn't exactly a work plan, right? But more of something that is more like an action plan. And I know that might sound like it's splitting hairs, but when it comes to doing this work, it's really about identifying what are those actions you can take in the short term, in the medium term, and the long term, but also having the flexibility of where you need to focus your energy and how you need to attend your efforts to really transform an organization's policies, programs, and practices. So as I wrap up, I just want to briefly mention a few things that we think we have found are really important for any organization that is getting started on this journey, or maybe you're well within your journey and you want to just maybe check in on your progress. So just a couple things to leave everyone with. First is an easy place to start is for any organization is to ask how do principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? Some of these main things that we were trying to adhere to, how do they align with and advance your organization's vision, mission, and values, right? That's an easy place to start in terms of looking at those. and making sure that when you're asking those questions, that you're including people from all levels within the organization. Another thing to keep in mind is that for everyone to prepare for some discomfort in the process, but to commit to the EDI journey. Discomfort is something that is normal when exploring some of these. That doesn't mean people are going to feel the same discomfort or discomfort at the same time, but it's more this commitment to working through it collaboratively that can really help you advance your goals as an organization. And finally, I just want to mention something about leaders and people who are, in those leadership roles, maybe leading this work, is that leaders can sometimes feel that they need to be an expert in equity, or they need to be an expert in racial justice to be seen as a leader on this work. And here it's really important for all of us to remember that everyone is on their own journey as it relates to our identity, understanding equity and inequity. And so what leaders can do is the same as everyone else, commit to continue to be on their own journey and commit to their own growth, while still taking on that leadership role of driving the work forward, right? And doing that while listening to the experiences of people across the organization and making sure that momentum and effort aren't lost. So we just wanted to leave a few brief ideas for you all as we wrap up. And thank you for your time. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Fran.
Thanks, Mark. I feel like we, started out discussing food and beverage companies, and then we're able to sort of open it up into a bigger discussion, and also with input from people who are working with organizations for accountability, not just sort of identifying from the outside what's going on. I have a few questions to ask. And, one thing, I guess, the one question I have for Mark and Shanece is, given this sort of bump that we're sort of seeing that we'd like really to be sustained in terms of companies caring about changes. Did you find that, and maybe from your other organizations, that there was an effort to seek out help from organizations like yours and others that was, higher at one time, and has that petered off, or is there a continuation that you're seeing? I guess I think this is sort of from a company's perspective of, we need help, what should we do, and that they're going to people. So either one of you could take that one.
Sure. Thanks, Fred. I'm happy to start there. I think it's really interesting because organizations are in so many different places. So absolutely, we have had, people who have come to us and say, hey, this is something that we want to work on. We have a lot of great ideas, but we need some help in maybe thinking through the process. Because, in a lot of ways, this is no different than a lot of, than in other organizational change processes, except that it's entirely different, and that we're often talking about a lot of things that people experience outside of work, right? That people experience as it relates to their identities and, who they are as a person. And so in those ways, it can go outside those bounds. And so certainly we do work with lots of organizations to do that. And also, I think for maybe you all on the call and in the audience, right? Organizations have been trying to do this type of work, maybe under different names, right? Maybe it, has been called different things. But this work often, comes back up through different events, maybe that we see, right? Through, the murder of George Floyd or other things, in the more distant past. And so, we can get that ebb and flow. And so that comment about leaders was really important because it's about maintaining that momentum, and it's about, recognizing that this work doesn't go away. And that, just because, we might not have focused on it for the last 3 months, that doesn't mean that we've totally given up. And so remembering that, there is value in just continuing to plug away at that. And of course, reaching out for help from, anyone who can kind of help understand that experience, I think is important.
Thanks. And Shanece, do you have anything to add to that, or can we just move on to the next question?
I think Mark covered it all. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So then this question is for Jim and Kirsten. So the question was, did you consider contacting companies directly to collect data? That's one part of the question. And then was there any outreach conducted with companies in your report after the publication of it? So I don't know who wants to take that. Kirsten, Jim?
Yeah, I can start, and then
Great.
Jim, if you have anything to add, you can feel free. So after we did our initial data collection, we compiled the information into specific to each company and shared what we found with each of the 25 companies. And we asked for them to send us any updates. We let them know about the project and that we were going to be making it publicly available. And so we did provide them an opportunity to provide additional data. Since we were really focused on publicly available information, and that was a very intentional choice that we made because we feel that transparency is important. And so this was information that we thought communities or companies should be sharing with communities. We only included data that companies provided if we could also verify it online. So there were a few instances where companies provided us updates, but it hadn't been made public yet. And so in those cases, we did not include those updates in our report. Once we finished and finalized our report, we did reach back out to every company with the final copy and offered to have conversations with them should they want to, and share the report with them. Anything to add to that, Jim?
Yeah, just two more points. One is, although we reached out to these companies, we found that very few were interested in engaging further in the conversation. So we talked with a couple of them, and I think this points to something that I'd love to hear actually from our fellow panelists is, what is it going to take to actually turn all this analysis and findings that we all have into action? We've heard about some of the work that As You Sow does through shareholder resolutions. We talked about some of the work that CommonHealth does through trainings, but what else can be done to move forward and hold these companies accountable to continuing to not only maintain, but actually increase their level of commitment to racial justice and equity? So I think that I'd love to hear from the other panelists on that. And then one just technical point is, as we did reach out to the companies, we did uncover additional actions that the companies shared with us. And quite a few of them, of the new actions, were not publicly available, so we didn't end up using them. But we, about half of the ones that they shared with us were publicly available and just difficult to find. And we ended up adding those into our count of actions. So again, pointing out to the fact that it's not an easy process to find what companies are doing, and there needs to be a whole lot more transparency here. But I'm interested from our fellow panelists, what are your strategies and tactics for getting companies to hold their feet to the fire, basically?
Yeah, and I just want to jump in there. It's easy to find these initiatives when they're pairing them with products and using them for marketing purposes. So from our perspective, interestingly, they were easy to find because companies are more than willing to talk about them because they were an opportunity to sort of market a product at the same time. And I want to make sure that we're pointing out, because I didn't have that much time, the importance for companies to do something and care about the issues is there. The issue that we have, or we're uncovering, is that it's paired with unhealthy products, and that there's little done to change the types of foods that are marketed to these communities to some healthier products in their portfolios. And I just wanted to add that because I don't want to appear as if we think that these initiatives aren't super important. They are. It's what are the companies doing other than that kind of maybe runs in conflict to what they're saying, and are they using these as a vehicle to promote unhealthy products? But I'll open it up to some more, from Jim was sort of asking everybody here, what more can be done to keep this moving forward? And I'll, see, does anyone want to take that up?
I'll jump in. From an As You Sow perspective, we believe it's really vital to engage all stakeholders, companies, investors, shareholders, consumers, and communities with information around racial equity to keep that movement flowing and to keep the motivation on these companies to really follow through on those 2020 promises.
Would anyone else like to add to that? Okay, well then I'll just kind of ask one more question that we just received in here. So this is for CommonHealth Action. Have you encountered the problem of companies that do more inclusive hiring, but then put the Black employees, for example, as the face of bad practices? You know, hiring Black marketers without changing what is marketed would be one example. So CommonHealth Action, can you answer that?
Sure, I'm happy to start, and I'll let Shanece to step in as well. So I haven't. So that obviously happens, right, in the world, right, where people look at this as mostly of a box checking activity, and they want to increase their numbers in terms of inputs or outputs, excuse me, of people who are, represent different races or different ethnicities, right? And that certainly is not going to, one, change anything, and actually does a lot of harm, right? Because you're bringing people in and not, changing what you're doing. I personally haven't seen that in many of the organizations we work with. One thing that I have seen that I think really speaks to what we've been talking about in this webinar is, since 2020, a lot of organizations have, been more forceful and been more, with their statements, as we've seen, through the research. So we've seen in some organizations people getting hired because they say, oh, wow, look at this organization, look at their commitments to racial justice, look at their commitments to equity. They must be doing a lot of great work out in the world. They get hired, they come in, and it is more like what we've been talking about, that these commitments, it sometimes end at the text, on the tweet, right? And that when they get into the organization, they recognize that, oh, wow, the way this organization runs, not only are they maybe not meeting the values that they say they are, they're not even doing that for their own employees, right? And so that is something that we have certainly seen where, people want to make those statements outwardly, but that the work to then, change things internally can take a long time. And if you're more willing to put things out, kind of in public than you are to do that work internally, that can create a real disconnect. And we've seen, organizations have quite a lot of turnover when people come in and realize, oh, this is not actually what I thought I signed up for. So hope that, helps a little bit. And, for organizations that are making those statements, realize that people may be coming to you because of those, and that you have to be ready to live up to those, not only in what you do externally, but how you, run the organization as well.
I would say, right after the death of George Floyd, we did receive a lot of companies coming to us, but it was just a check mark for them, saying that, hey, we're doing this work, check it off. There was no sustainability plan set or up to keep the work going. So when we're looking at companies such as, when we're looking at companies making these type of commitments towards equity, diversity, and inclusion, and they're only doing it for a check mark, you will also find on their social media pages that they're trending with what's going on currently in the world. So the death of George Floyd, they made those promises to the public, and then they moved on to something else. An example of a company that's doing that is Chipotle. If you go to their Twitter page, as soon as the death of George Floyd happened, they had all these commitments towards racial justice, social justice. But now if you look back at their Twitter feed right now, you do not see any of type of commitments towards that, or them sustaining those commitments or keeping their promises.
Yeah, and thank you both for that response, and then also for outlining an example, Shanece, because I think that is helpful to sort of understand an issue when you have a hard example for it. Olivia, a question for you is, how have companies responded to these racial justice scorecards? Can you talk a little bit about what you hear back, or what kind of interactions happen around these scorecards with companies?
Absolutely. I'd say it really depends on the sector. So when we're approaching, say, energy companies with our environmental justice KPIs, we're more likely to meet resistance and a lot of questions on why environmental justice is part of a racial justice scorecard. So the majority of 2021 was explaining why this is important, why this is a material risk to companies, and then going from there. Other companies honestly have been quite proactive with reaching out to us and are really invested in making material changes to their business practices in favor of racial equity. So I'd say overall, the Russell 1000 is probably split between proactive and non-proactive. As Shanece was saying, we've seen in the past 6 months, many companies taking down those 2020 statements, which is quite problematic. And we've brought their scores down as a result of that to really motivate companies to keep this going, keep on that racial equity journey. And all of our organizations are here to help.
Does anyone have any thing to add to that for, companies? And I don't know whether for Jim and Kirsten, if you saw sort of behaviors from your food and beverage companies, but were there some sort of differences in how companies responded to your requests based on anything? Or was it, just did it feel just sort of random who responded to you and who didn't?
One of the things I think from the food and beverage sector is looking at some of the beverage companies, particularly like Pepsi and Coke. And Pepsi and Coke have a long history of trying to, particularly Coke, establishing close relationships with the Black community. And early on, I think they did that because they recognized this was going to be a growing market share and they wanted to work there. And so it was viewed as part of their marketing strategy and tied directly to their business practices. And as a result of that, they were, I think, more proactive than a lot of the other companies that we looked at because they had that tradition and base of doing that. But whether that, as Fran, your work has pointed out, how that squares up with their marketing activities and their particularly the racialized marketing activities, there's real contradictions in terms of what they're doing with one hand versus the other hand.
Thanks.
I'll just add quickly to that, as far as hearing back from companies, we didn't get a lot of response to us sharing the reports with them. A couple of emails interested, but it all kind of petered out. Not a lot of follow through there. So, yeah.
Thanks. Well, we have about a minute left. I don't know if anyone, any of the participants would like to share anything else in closing. Okay, well, I do appreciate the time that participants took out of their day to attend this. And I just want to remind everyone that the recording of this session will be available on the Rudd Center's website. We'll share it with all of the panelists here, the presenters here. And we are also going to be sharing the links that the presenters provided on our website. So people can find out a bit more information on what was presented here. And I'm sure all of the presenters today would be interested in answering any further questions. If you are unable to reach anyone here, feel free to contact us and we will connect you with the presenters. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to host this. I'm really glad that we connected and went beyond our food and beverage world, which is sometimes, that we don't normally do. But I think it was really enlightening, and we have a lot to learn from our work when we look at what's happening in other spaces outside of food and beverage. I think it's really valuable and helpful, for our area of focus. So thank you for these great presentations, and again, have a wonderful day, and thank you for your time.